everyone, welcome to a special REAP Project video. In honor of Women's History Month, the REAP Project has produced a special highlight compilation from our previous Diversity and Inclusion series in collaboration with WIAN, the Women International Affairs Network. In this series, we gathered a number of incredible women mentors at the forefront of the international development and humanitarian sector. We asked them a few questions related to their personal experience and how gender identity affect their career development, as well as their reflection on the diversity and inclusion issue in the wider sector. This video showcased a brief highlight of our interview. If you're interested in learning more about each mentor, you can find the link to their individual podcasts in the video description below. Our first question is, what are some gendered obstacles you have faced in your career? And this is a brief highlight of some of the most common answers that we have received. As you can see, a lot of this are revolved around recognition as well as workplace safety and harassment. Now, let's hear it from our mentors in their own words.
One of the obstacles for me was to be recognised as someone who wasn't just there to add to the gender diversity statistics. I was there to make a real contribution.
Entering the field, I did find that there was quite a few spaces that seemed to be very much male dominated. So as a woman coming into that field, at times I did feel a little bit out of place. And I can give you an example. I remember during my work in Uganda, I was a country director of a charity, and we were working on a policy at the time. And I was invited to a meeting with a number of lawyers at the Ministry of Education, and we were looking at a local government act, and everyone in the room was male except for me. And everything seemed fine at the outset. However, as we sort of worked through the act that we were looking at and how to amend it, I began asking questions about how will this be implemented in practice and just asking some practical questions. And it became quite apparent my questions were not perhaps wanted, and perhaps that I should just be there and listen as opposed to question what was happening in the room. Whereas the male counterparts in the room, if they had any questions or any suggestions, they appeared to be able to have that platform. So that was quite an interesting space, and I found quite a few of those in this field.
VC investor with the development hat on, I'd say one of the biggest challenges for women is that they're seen as more risk averse and less assertive, which makes a lot of women leaders overcompensate for it by working extra hard and putting more effort, being extra aggressive. But at the same time, they're still compared against more perfectionist standards than their male peers. So in order to encourage more innovative women leadership, this view on women needs to change ASAP.
There are cultural undercurrents and power distances which seek to maintain a certain hierarchy sometimes. For instance, in certain meetings, you do see that it appears to be okay for male representatives to be more outspoken or to interrupt, whereas if a woman was to do that, the expectation is to be more demure.
There is an extremely evident background that women are treated differently in the sector, and I've had experiences where they're expecting male or they're not expecting me to look or be who I am. So when we're working with people, whether it be corporates or the business world, that's probably where I've experienced my largest downfalls in terms of inclusive spaces. If a man showed the characteristics that I do when I'm upset, they'd be like, good on you for showing that, good on you for caring, rah, rah, rah. But with me, it's like, oh, you're an emotional woman, or like, you know, you need to hide these emotions, or you need to moderate the behavior. Sometimes that's true, but a lot of the time it's not. Moderating behavior is circumstantial, but it's really important to be passionate and to feel these emotions and to do it openly. And it's very interesting that my characteristics as a woman are often pegged as feminine or womanly and therefore like downcast as a leader. And they're the things that I think make me a great leader. I think my empathy and my emotional response to things, and that I try and be a really authentic person, not just as a leader, but just genuinely as myself, is really heavily critiqued all the time.
I previously worked at a funder, and there was this perception that I had to be a man to hold that role as a grant manager in this organization. Even if, I would sign off every email with my name, I noticed there were some folks who would not reconcile the fact that I was a woman and holding this position. I remember when I had to go for site visits, one of them asking whether my supervisor would be coming, and I had gone to in country alone. And the fact that I was a young woman, I was under 25 years old, I was not married, no children, I could tell that there was definitely a disconnect between who they thought I should look like or I should be.
To answer this question, a lot of our mentors touched on the topic of sexual harassment, and some of them even gave us stories based on their personal experience. Now let's hear it from them.
Perhaps more women are speaking about now is the issue of harassment as well in the workplace. And I think that over the years that I have worked in this field, I have experienced harassment by male counterparts. And it is something that more and more women are talking about, and definitely something that does need to be discussed more generally in the field.
Area that it was of concern is genuine safety and well-being, and particularly for women and young people overseas. And there have been various experiences. In India, it wasn't so much as the work itself, it wasn't as much as of a safety or well-being issue, largely because I was doing research, so I had escorts to different places, etc. Definitely in the community, there are elements where I definitely felt unsafe as a young woman. I was traveling by myself as a young white woman with blonde hair and Anglo features and things like that. There are a few instances, particularly in Delhi and Mumbai, where I felt quite unsafe, and there were large groups of men and things like that. And that can be a difficult thing in of itself. And I think that's hard to separate the work from the actual community and environment. It's very hard for me because some of the experience was one of the best parts and best elements that I've ever worked in, but others were really challenging. Examples of this were doing the research. I would go to CEOs or founders or senior business people in an organisation, and I was doing research on fair trade. And then being in the room with them and asking them questions, sometimes they just wouldn't answer. And there was one example where I went in to ask questions and I was just told that they were expecting a male and that they wouldn't take any questions from me. Obviously, this is a rarity, and I'm not saying that this occurs all the time, but there is systemic oppression of women in various communities, and I'm not one to pinpoint India and say that that's the case everywhere, but certainly that was my experience, and that was in an academic field. Other examples of this would be working in Argentina. I was doing some field work in the north of Argentina, working with a young man, and we often got asked to share the same room, which was totally fine because being resource and capacity drained, it's a really difficult thing. It's quite normal to share spaces. However, there were a few incidents where I felt extremely unsafe and really felt like my safety and well-being was compromised. And I don't want to underlabel things because I think it's really important to call things out what they were, but I would definitely say there was elements of sexual harassment and abuse within that, and that was really difficult. And when reporting that within Argentina, it was a local-based organisation. It was just completely thrown out and not taken seriously. So I think understanding and working for organisations that respect and implement policies that protect women is really important. And often that isn't the case in many communities in different sectors. So that's something that I've had to learn really strongly. And, it is becoming a bigger thing, particularly with Australian and Asia specific sector. But it's certainly an issue right around the world and still existing.
The next question we asked our mentor is, what improvements are needed to ensure a more equitable outcome for women pursuing a career in the international development sector? And here are some of their answers. A change in power structure, flexible working, and changing cultural norms are some of the answers that are frequently mentioned. Now let's hear it from our mentors.
How do you ensure more equitable outcomes for women? A way might be to look at shared employment. And it can come out in other ways too, like paid maternity leave or providing suitable accommodation for families to move, and just general transparency for equal pay.
Flexible working, being able to have the opportunity to work from home. But there are lots of different ways of cutting up and making a working week happen and be productive for both women who are wanting to have a family or have another activity that they want to participate in, and men. That's also really, really important that, women don't get ahead unless men can sometimes be at home to look after children.
I think it's 80% of all persons working in the international development sector are women, and we only represent 48% of senior management. And for me, yes, that's a good stat alone, but when you recognise that women are the people working in the sector, but a lot of men hold senior management positions, I think that's a core issue. I think the solution needs to be transferring power, like actively reflecting on who we are as an organisation and what we do, and and questioning ourselves every day, saying, am I the right person for this role? And that's something I would ask myself, honestly, if not every day, at least every week. Am I the right person for this role? And sometimes I'm like, no, I'm not. This role should be held by a person of colour, or it should be held from one of the countries that we work in. But most of the time I think, yeah, I'm a young woman. I've got lived adversity. I'm actively trying to transfer power. I'm someone who can actually do that. And I've got to own my own merit here. But I think we need to be actively looking at ourselves and reflecting and asking those really hard questions about where do we actually sit, and what is our role within the organisation and within the sector more broadly.
This sort of mindset or unconscious bias can be addressed as more women, particularly from different ethnicities, become part of leadership groups. And breaking through these kind of stereotypes and biases, I think, will really ensure that most people who come into this space will be able to bring their whole self and their individual viewpoints to the table, which is what you want at the end of the day, for people to be authentic and be able to be who they are themselves.
In terms of the sector, I think there needs to be a lot of not just discussion, but action plans put into place to see how we can take a more intersectional approach to development. So many policies, procedures, and programs that are being created internationally about women. The question is, how many of the women that are actually being affected by these programs are involved in even program design, or given any opportunity to give their input into the discussion on program design? And when you're really trying to direct this program to have the impact on these women's lives, surely you need to speak to these women. You need to understand what their experiences are, what the challenges are, and how they feel they want to be supported, as opposed to creating a program and deciding this is what particular women need and this is how we're going to administer it, without involving the women who are actually experiencing the issues.
The current project I'm working on around fostering the tech ecosystem in Africa, when it comes to funding African startups, there's a lot of disparity when it comes to male versus female-founded startups. And the recent data that has been published on startup funding in Africa, so in 2021, startup raised over 4.3 billion in funding, and of that amount, less than 1% went to female founders or teams with all female founders. And that is really sad, because given that amount, 1% is really a small amount. This shows the point at which the sector is at and the change that needs to happen to really boost more funding into female startups. And I think, as a person working in tech policy and a person working with policymakers, I think my call to that would be to create policies and to create an environment where more women are able to enter into the tech field, but more women are able to get funded. But on the other side as well, the funding landscape itself is very much male dominated. So I would say to also focus on having more female fund managers, female VCs, who are writing checks to startups, who are funding startups. That in a way would help support and help bring up those numbers. So having women on both sides of the table as founders, but also as VCs and fund managers as well.
Last question we gave our mentor is, what advice would you give women who are just starting out their career in the aid and development sector? Below are some of their answers, among which mentorship, a growth mindset, and confidence are some of the most recurring answers. Now let's hear it from our mentors.
So my advice for women would be, know your worth and take up space. Don't step back. Don't worry about stepping on toes. Don't worry about being seen to be taking up space. That is exactly what we're there to do. And owning your power and owning who you are and being authentic to who you are is so crucial. But call out bullshit when you see it. Like, call out internalized misogyny, call out internalized racism. It's bloody hard. And I probably I don't even have the right or the authority to say that as a white person. But I guess for anyone who's white and listening, if you see internalized racism, you need to call it out. That is your responsibility more than people of color. So as a woman, we need to stand together and we need to support one another. If you're experiencing or seeing your colleagues who are women or people of color or from other minorities, the queer community, whatever it is, we need to support one another. And it truly is women who have your backs. And
It's going to sound awfully cliched, but it's finding that passion and, or at least a direction towards your passion is really important. And then taking that lead for ensuring that you can somehow be brave enough to take the first step, even if you can't see the whole road. And I knew that the people that I had met who seemed to, have that fullness of life or that contentment were doing something that they truly loved and that they were passionate about. And I could feel that that was something missing for me. And so it really prompted me after a lot of soul searching to take that step of leaving. One thing that I found which was really helpful for me was this Japanese concept of ikigai, which talks about finding the intersection of what you're good at, what you love, what you can be paid for, and what the world needs align. And you find your sweet spot or your reason for being. And it's very difficult, of course, to get to that point sometimes. But I found that having found that concept, I had a big blackboard for me with lots of post-it notes where I started to just articulate what I wanted, what were my skill sets, and really starting to identify how I could align them. But like I said before, it takes a long time, and you might end up doing particular projects or particular things which are not exactly there. But if it's the direction that you want to head in, then keep trying and persevere.
Getting clear on what you want to do and what your area of interests are. I think I've met quite a few women who want to move into development but not sure of which area, what are they interested in, what are they good at. So I think you really need to get a good grasp of that. And in order to do that, I think it's really, really important that you research. So if you're interested in women's empowerment, women's rights, start to do some research into that area. See what the opportunities are. Find a role model. So for me, I remember going online, looking at LinkedIn, because I'm on LinkedIn quite a bit, and finding profiles of people who are doing the sort of work that I thought I wanted to do, and seeing what their experiences were. What had they done? What courses had they taken part in? What sort of roles had they had? And really trying to model my work on what they had done. So really finding that role model.
And the other thing that I do tell women is be willing to step out of your comfort zone. Women, research shows, tend to not be willing to look at a role unless they have a much higher level of alignment with the essential criteria. It is so important that women put the application in. It is something that is very often off-putting to women, and I say, just do it.
Being open to learning and having a growth mindset is really, really important because, as I mentioned, the sector is vast, but the issues in each region are also different. So you have to be excited to learn. It's important to advance your knowledge, but don't be too caught up in the number of certifications. Find your niche and go deeper is one thing I'd be excited for them to really pay close attention to.
Thank you everyone for tuning in, and thank you to all of our amazing mentors of this series. If you like our content, be sure to subscribe to our newsletter on our website and follow our LinkedIn page for more updates.